In the economic sphere, which I will focus on this afternoon, most of the complaints center around China's failure to redress what we call imbalances. Let's look at some of those important ones. The trade deficit. The enormous US-China trade deficit, in fact, stands at $145 billion through July 2010. It continues to grow despite a rise in US exports to China year on year of nearly 36%. Foreign exchange reserves. China's neo-mercantilist accumulation of nearly $2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves results from China's management of the RMB and its ever-mounting holdings of US government debt. Even though the yuan has appreciated over 20% against the dollar since China announced its policy of permitting gradual float. Savings rates. The vast differential between saving rates in the two societies, Chinese saving 50% or more of their disposable income, with the US barely saving 5% after the wake-up call of a near-total collapse of US financial markets in 2008. Protectionism. China's continued protectionism, manifested by its unabashed tolerance of pervasive non-tariff barriers to import market penetration by Western countries, and its recent Buy China actions, including regulations requiring governments at all levels to give preference to domestic goods and products with so-called indigenous innovation. Daily, the press reports much unhappiness by US and European multinational corporations who complain of unfair treatment. Access to investment opportunities. China's go-slow attitude toward liberalizing restrictions on foreign investment in Chinese enterprises and maintenance of strict controls on capital account transactions. Another imbalance is China's seemingly insatiable appetite for technology transfer accompanied by deliberately minimalist protection of intellectual property of all types. China's insistence also that agreement on climate change must be prefaced by US agreement to shoulder unequal responsibility for carbon footprint reduction based on past bad boy behavior in the preceding 2 centuries. The critical element here of these imbalances is, of course, that while no one would disagree that they should all at least be addressed, if not entirely remedied, the 3 US estates have, for the most part, reached common agreement that the failure is China's failure. It almost goes without saying that the cause of US unemployment, notwithstanding the substantial body of economic study that suggests that revaluation of the renminbi would have a negative impact on employment because a decline in Chinese imports of US goods would offset any gains from increased exports. China, where there continues to be mainly one estate, the government, although I must say that one of the biggest changes that has really come about in the last 6 months or a year is that there's a growing encouragement by the government for public dialogue on different viewpoints by approved officials and scholars and think tanks. But anyway, the government of China, by contrast, seldomly openly criticizes US policies. But in off-the-record conversations, Chinese officials do not hesitate to say that US complaints are mostly thinly veiled excuses for failed US economic policies. We fostered reckless credit creation by our financial institutions. We created huge budget deficits from foreign adventurism, and the cost of 2 wars in the first decade of the 21st century and unaffordable social programs, including most recently near universal health care, with a resulting unsustainable debt burden on future generations. China privately says it cannot and will not pay for our mistakes. China's entirely enviable record of nearly 10% average real growth over the past 10 years contrasts strongly with the U.S.'s anemic economic record over the same period. Chinese at all levels are saying, why do we have to learn from the United States? Chinese believe that they can forego consumption now because their children will be able to buy it cheaper later. They have little respect for a society that leaves it to future generations to pay for current conspicuous consumption. China is indeed a rising power, but we are, of course, a great power. This is a time for clarity, vision. We need to be patient and practical. It is time to observe and not obfuscate issues. Also, I think we should start learning from China's success. Just as China studies us, we should study them. That is not to say that we ought to abandon our strong adherence to free trade and free markets. But it does mean that we can look at China's national priorities and see what we can learn from how China manages its priorities and its goals. And we will get into a discussion later, I think this hour, after David has talked more about the rising power, so that you will see, I hope you will come to better understand my perspective. I don't look at China with pink glasses. I don't mean to sound like that. But I do think that we could study them and how they operate in the world and how they set their priorities. If we look with energy self-efficiency, emphasis on green energy, mainly renewables, and increased, I would say massively increased, research and development spending. For example, they've spent, or in the process of spending, at least $10 billion on smart grid technology. And they've earmarked $300 billion for their high-speed rail train versus our $8 billion for a high-speed rail train. They've spent spending $125 billion for healthcare reform in 3 years. There's also an increasing emphasis, I'd like to point out, on science and technology in higher education. That means graduating more scientists and engineers and offering support for higher education that enables the best and brightest students to enter teaching and research without crushing burdens from student loans. Also, while it is surely correct to attach great importance to the management of our bilateral relationship with China, it is equally important to recognize that our economies, while certainly growing more closely linked each day, are by no means mutually interdependent. China represents less than 15% of U.S. global trade, and the U.S. represents less than 15% of China's global trade. Calls for much more rapid economic and financial integration, like Jeffrey Karabel's proposal for a joint central bank, seem out of touch with reality. It is of course important that we continue to work on a bilateral investment treaty. China would have liked to buy Unocal, and we would like to be able to buy a company like CNOOC. But we should not be surprised if neither side finds it easy to make the kinds of commitments such a proposal ordinarily entails. We should not underestimate China's fear of foreign entanglement stemming from a century of foreign domination propped up by unequal treaties, nor should we be less sanguine about the political dimensions of a China treaty in our own Congress. Managing expectations will go a long way in enabling us to cooperate with China in areas of great importance and where no sacrifice of economic or geopolitical sovereignty is necessary. We can certainly work together on securing the international financial system against systemic risk and contagion from the failure of large financial institutions. In fact, there are many, many issues where we can work together with China by toning down the rhetoric and managing expectations. I hope we'll get into some of the discussion of those this hour. But let me just say, before asking David to start, I believe that eventually we will see major changes in China. Economic progress will demand that protection barriers are dismantled. China will evolve towards a much greater respect for the rule of law, I do not expect any breakdown like the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Global integration will bring greater intellectual and political freedom, but the forces for these changes will come from within China, and we cannot and should not seek to impose them from without. Thanks, and I'd like to now have David, I think he's going to discuss China as a rising power and the balance of power from a military and geopolitical securities perspective.
Well, I think Mary has very skillfully outlined for you some of the differences that we see between China and the U.S. On economic matters. What I'm going to try to do is give you a sense for broader aspects of the relationship, including both the diplomatic and the military, so that by the end of our two presentations, you will see sort of a combined picture, and I think that'll set the stage for the type of questions that we typically have at this kind of forum. I think it's fair to say that there are two principal schools of thought about Chinese foreign policy. What are the Chinese up to? One basically could be summarized as China is different, and the other is essentially the rising power school. Now, what do I mean by these two schools? The school that says China is different are often people who are Chinese historians or historians of China. They're people who look at the history of China's relations with its neighbors and basically argue that China does not have a sort of consistent history, at least, of dominating peoples who are non-Chinese. They'll say the Chinese typically don't use force in their foreign relations, and China has been conquered by both the Mongols and the Manchus, and is therefore very sensitive about maintaining its borders. These are reasonable generalizations, but they can be refuted. China uses force when it's to its advantage. In the last 30 years, or 40 years, you've seen China use force dealing with the Indians in their border war, with the Vietnamese, in their differences over how Cambodia should be handled, and then minor dust-ups in the South China Sea, and of course firing missiles off the Taiwan coast in 1996 to try to intimidate Taiwan when Taiwan was pursuing its first presidential election. So the evidence for this school is somewhat mixed, but it also depends how you define Chinese. The Chinese now, of course, occupy Tibet, and they occupy Xinjiang. What is now Xinjiang was an independent country between World War I and World War II. It's called Chinese Turkestan. And of course, Tibet has a long history of being a suzerainty of China, but being autonomous. So it depends how you define these things. And those who are more sympathetic to China present that as if China has a right to these positions, and those who are more critical of China obviously are going to take a more skeptical stance. Now, the Rising Power School is a group of more strategically oriented, militarily oriented specialists who say that the history of rising powers who have the economic capabilities that Mary has outlined for us are ones where generally they try to use that economic influence to gain other advantages. So the Rising Power School looks at the rise of Germany in the 19th century. It looks at the rise of Japan, particularly in the 1930s, and of course at the Soviet Union in the post-World War II period. And that school is very, very conscious of the kinds of choices that China is now making in terms of its military expansion. You probably haven't followed this because it's rather technical, but the range of choices that the Chinese have made in terms of their military acquisition are almost entirely recently in the direction of power projection. And not only have they dramatically increased their missile production, which at the moment is meant mostly to intimidate Taiwan, but the Chinese now have a very, very substantial fleet of attack submarines. They are laying the basis for building 2 aircraft carriers. But most importantly, the Chinese have begun to build what they call the String of Pearls, which is their bases in Burma, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. Now, each of these is sort of interesting. Burma is important because both India and China compete for influence there, and Burma was admitted to ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so it's sort of a fulcrum between China and India. It's a country that the US has very little relations with because of our sanctions, but both China and India are very actively involved in Burma. Why is Burma important? It's important because of its location between the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, and also to the south of China. But it also has excellent port facilities, and even more important than that, it has important intelligence facilities in a group of islands called the Coco Islands that can monitor almost all the ship traffic that goes through the Malacca Straits. Similarly, in the last 18 months, the Chinese have moved to set up a base in Sri Lanka in a place called Hambantota. Most of you probably haven't followed that, but it's a source of great interest among strategic specialists. Similarly, they are expanding the port facilities in Dhaka and Bangladesh. And most importantly, in terms of the balance between India and Pakistan, the Chinese are setting up very substantial facilities in an island called Gwadar in Pakistan, which is in the west of India, and but most importantly, will give China the ability to project power to the edge of the western side of the Indian Ocean and also the entrance to the Persian Gulf. So these are big investments. They're probably long-term investments. And so people who are looking at the rise in power aspects of China will focus on these features. Now, my personal view is that I would describe China's strategy as a mixed strategy. It is certainly not one to emphasize the military first. The Chinese have placed a very strong emphasis on economics. For example, with Southeast Asia, they decided to set up a free trade agreement, which was extremely well received in Southeast Asia. Also, some of you who remember the 1997 financial crisis will remember that the Chinese were the first to offer any substantial aid to Thailand. At the time that the US was giving the back of the hand to Thailand, the Chinese simply wrote them a check for $1 billion and said, we hope this is helpful. The Thai remember that, and they also remember the treatment they got from the Clinton administration. So the Chinese are very conscious of how to use economic incentives, and they use them very effectively. And I think that they will typically lead with economics if they can. Now this leads them to some questionable choices as far as we're concerned. They have a very close relationship with Iran, with Sudan, lots of involvement in parts of Africa where corruption is high, and this is generally labeled their natural resource strategy. But there's no question that economics is the leading part of that. Now, why do I say that I think China has a mixed strategy? I say that because if economics doesn't work, then they escalate and use a combination of either diplomatic pressure or military pressure. Now, what do I mean by that? Probably you've been following the last couple of days the dust-up between the Japanese and the Chinese over the islands, which the Japanese call the Senkakus, or the Chinese call the Diaoyu. The basic problem here, as we know under at least Western law, that possession is 9/10 of the law. The Japanese possess the islands. The Chinese have been challenging this in a variety of fashions. And recently, a Chinese boat rammed a Japanese Coast Guard cutter, and the Japanese took the crew and the captain hostage, and are holding the captain, though they've released the crew. Now, this may sound like a minor dust-up, but it's the type of thing where I think China is expressing its frustration at not being able to get what it wants through bargaining directly with Japan. From my experience in dealing with the Japanese on some of these matters, I don't think the Japanese are going to concede. So I think this kind of diplomatic pressure is going to rise. Now, when does it become important for the Chinese to be willing to threaten force? I think they threaten force much the same way we do, when they feel their vital interests are at stake. And I think this is what's different that many people in the West need to get used to, and that is that unlike the period under Mao, when foreign policy and force was used as essentially a means to project ideology, now force, or at least the threat of force, is going to be used to project the broader national interest. Now, where is this going to show up? It's already showing up over differences between the US and China over how to handle North Korea. It certainly will be a major part of our relations and dealings over Taiwan. And it's already now increasingly a source of friction over what are called the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. The Chinese foreign minister went to the Southeast Asian Summit meeting a month ago and said that China had indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea. Now, again, for those of you who have any experience on maritime issues, the Western view of this is that nobody owns international waters. And certainly the ASEAN countries strongly resented China saying that they had indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea. So this is a setup for increasing tension, and the question is, how will it be played out? So I think I'll wrap up there. What I'm trying to give you is a sense that China, not only through its economic potential, but a broader sense of what it can do diplomatically and strategically, is beginning to flex its muscles and say what its strategic interests are. So I think with that background, we may want to turn to questions. Thanks.
So we'll go right to the audience. Are there microphones somewhere in the back or not? Okay, excellent. So we'll just use the regular routine. State your name and affiliation. Make it a question, not a statement, and try to get as many as we can as possible. Yes, sir. Okay. You want to wait for the microphone?
Sure. The question that arises after listening to the two presenters is the rise of China a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, we have our own way of looking at it, but you know, ever since the US became a sole superpower with no checks and balances, it sort of lost control and it's begun to be seen as a bully. So, you know, I'm presenting the argument and I'd like your views on it, that maybe it's a good thing to have some checks and balances, and it may promote for a more orderly world.
Sure. I mean, I'll make a couple comments on that. I think the answer as to whether it's good and bad is it depends where you sit. And so I think the statement that you've made clearly has, merits. I think that the rise of China is not something that is unexpected. I think that it depends as we watch China move into the world order. So far, I'm sorry I didn't get your name, but China has been reluctant to really take a lead or take some of the responsibility. It has adhered very strongly to the non-interference principle, which means that as it grows in economic and military and power, I think it remains to be seen on different fronts, exactly how it will act and how it will cooperate and work among various countries. I mean, I think that's.
Next question, sir.
Yes, Jeffrey Milton. Tied in with the gender imbalance that's been caused by the one-child policy in the last couple of generations, history tells us that when you get such a severe gender imbalance, it can lead to war. Is this something that is on anyone's mind in Asia in terms of geographic expansion because of the gender imbalance?
I would say it's certainly not at the top of people's minds, and I don't think it's all that likely. On the grounds that a war to acquire wives. I mean, is that what you're implying?
Well, when young men come to
it seems to me that many thoughtful people have looked at the issue of how the one-child policy, the gender imbalance, and the four-grandparent problem in China will affect the Chinese. I don't think that many have focused on the question of will it lead to war. There are a growing number of immigrants going into China from different places. A large number from Russia, for example, a growing number from Southeast Asia, and of course over 700,000 from Taiwan. The people going from Taiwan are mostly male, however, and they're often marrying wives in China, or at least finding girlfriends. So I think this issue of the gender imbalance is not the most critical element of the demography of China that matters. The most critical element is that they will, in the next 20 years, face a problem similar to what Japan is facing today. On the other hand, as Mary mentioned, the Chinese have a savings rate of over 50% of disposable income. And if that were to decline dramatically, then they would have trouble financing old age care for their parents and grandparents. And I think it will decline over time. I don't think it's going to decline dramatically. And so I really wouldn't see the gender imbalance issue in any overly dramatic terms.
In terms, I just add a couple of comments. There has been tremendous research done on that issue. And somebody at Columbia, Shangjin Wei, has actually propositioned that in fact it will affect the economy of China ultimately. And it usually draws a number of laughs because of course that's very long term and not short term. I've also heard women speak that from panels in the US who say that maybe they ought to go over to China because they're unmarried and look for husbands there. But more seriously, the two issues that it does seem to impact and that is being studied is from a corporate consumer buying. Who will make the purchases within the families? And in fact, in Guangzhou, which is one of the provinces where the gender imbalance is extremely lopsided, there's also concern that many males who are not able to marry are often males that also can't find jobs, and that this will lead to an international kind of criminality or corruption or gangs around the world. So the two areas that really have taken study in terms of gender imbalance has been marketing, corporate, and possible criminal increase.
Yes. Where the microphone?
Okay, well.
That's for everybody else to hear your question.
Hi, I'm Ellen Easton. My question is, with the Chinese economy now embracing the auto industry, not just for manufacturing, but for their own consumption, how will that affect the impact of oil relations with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations, even Iran, as they require more consumption of oil? How is that going to affect our position in the U.S., economically?
I mean, I'll just make a couple comments and take a comment. The numbers, which I understand are associated with that, is that at present there are 11 million autos, I guess, in the United States. There are 18 million in China, and that by 2030 they expect to have 40 million. If any of you have been to China and tried to get either from the east side of Beijing to the west side of Beijing, which is the Wall Street of China, Zhongjie, in the morning at rush hour or getting back, it takes almost an hour and 15 minutes for what should be a 10 or 15-minute ride. It's just extraordinary. And the things that the government has done in terms of trying to cut back on the number of cars has not been as effective as they hoped. You know, cutting back on license plates or whatever, but people just make 2 license plates so that they end at different numbers and they can come in on the other days. The answer to your question basically is, if every Chinese has 2 or 3 cars per family, as the United States wishes and often has 2 or 3 cars per family, there won't be enough oil and there will be increasing friction over that. I don't know if you know statistics.
Well,
Dave, I don't know.
okay, let me just elaborate on the foreign policy implications. China's interest in natural resources is not just limited to oil. As you probably followed, it's limited to a whole series of energy alternatives, but also they have a strong interest in metals, and they are now very interested in farmland and producing crops under their direction in other countries. Now, what this means is that the Chinese have made big investments in some of the countries that I already mentioned, like Sudan and Iran, which we find objectionable given our foreign policy objectives. But they're also making big investments very close to us. The Chinese have agreed to build a major refinery to handle the heavy crude in Venezuela. They're going to be buying oil from Venezuela. They have agreements now with the Brazilians. And the other thing, which many Americans are not aware of, is that a Chinese-controlled firm, Hutchison Whampoa, based in Hong Kong, now manages the Panama Canal. So Teddy Roosevelt must be rolling over in his grave over this. But the real point is that, and that's what I think both Mary and I are trying to say, that Americans need to accept the fact that China is already a major power on the world stage, and it's going to be bigger. And so they're going to have not only a demand for these resources, but they're going to have economic potential to move actively. Now, I think if you were looking at Chinese policy towards Latin America, you'd want to say, to what extent is China cooperating with Chavez in Venezuela for political reasons or economic reasons? And the answer is almost certainly a combination. But China is getting a very good reception in Bolivia from a left-wing government there, a reasonable reception from a moderate left government in Brazil. So there's a political and an economic component to these. You can't separate them. But the real thing is this surge in demand, and as we're both saying, as the middle class in China grows, there's every reason to expect that they're going to want these materials, they're going to want these products, in the same way that we in this country have wanted them in the last century.
And affecting our population.
Absolutely. Sure.
Can I ask you a question about a cultural issue? Innovation. Most of the growth in the last 15 years in China has been based on lots of investment, understanding on the consumer side, and societies that are economically successful they innovate. Right? Innovation produces improvements in production, which produces profits. The United States has led in that regard for the last 100 years. Are there cultural things? Once you can't invest away the growth anymore, are there cultural issues around China's ability to compete with the United States and other places in innovation and creating new things, not just taking what other people have done and doing a little bit better? How would you assess that?
Well, in economics, this is a very hot topic. Not just China's role in it, but the general question of whether being a leader is an advantage or not. In fact, it was assumed, people like Raymond Vernon wrote extensively on this in the 50s and 60s. It was assumed that if you were the leader, you got to dominate and set the protocols for what was going on. That's no longer true in many areas. Sometimes companies that are second or even third in a field may be able to come up with something better, and also the setting of many of the protocols, things like telecommunications, is political and it's not entirely on technical grounds. But in the book that I did comparing China and India and their rise, I did a pretty extensive survey of the debate about whether China could continue to grow. My view is that China will not grow at 10%, but I don't see any reason why China can't grow at 6 to 8% for a very long period. And they can do that not necessarily by leading in innovation, but being competent in innovation. The way they can continue to grow is by absorbing the people who are now in the rural areas into the modern sector. And it's important to remember that 80% of the Chinese are still in the rural areas. So they have a vast internal market that they can exploit. And as Mary mentioned in her presentation, the really important thing is the Chinese are already producing more engineers at the undergraduate level than we are. Now, that doesn't necessarily produce innovation, but I don't see any reason, certainly from the quality of the graduate students that I get from China, I don't see any reason why in the next, say, 10 to 20 years, the Chinese aren't going to be leading. But just to give you an example, I sit at NYU, I sit on an interdepartmental committee which sort of evaluates the PhD scholarships that are being offered. And so each department therefore gets to watch what the other department is doing in terms of what it's offering in terms of PhD fellowships. And when I first started looking at the files for the physics department, I noticed something striking. Every single person that they were offering a PhD fellowship to was Chinese. 100% of it. Now, I questioned that because it seemed to me that there are lots of talented people from other countries, notably India and other parts of the world, who probably should have been there. And I do think there were some idiosyncratic features about this. But my point is, I don't think there's any shortage of talented Chinese. I think the question is, how are they going to be deployed, and how will the development of this internal market work? And Mary and I have talked about this in other settings, but you know, the Chinese can't continue to grow exports at 28 or 30% a year indefinitely. They're going to have to change their export-oriented strategy. But the good news is they have an internal market which can absorb these goods. But to come back to the lady's question, they're still going to need materials to make the products. So it is going to create an international demand for materials and energy, even if they focus their growth more.
Any other questions out there? Yes, in the back? Sorry, come over here now. Nothing on the left side yet. Oh, okay, there you go.
Check.
No, you go after this guy.
All right.
I was just chiding you guys.
Yeah, Max here. Quick question. There was a study that came out 2 to 3 weeks ago that measured the size of the top 300 investment funds globally. And a new entrant to the top 20
Global investment funds.
global investment funds, a study by Pensions Investment Magazine. And a new entrant to the top 20 was the Chinese National Social Security Fund, and which has grown at a combined annual growth rate for the last 5 years of 40%, double that of the other people in the top 20. And this struck me because often we say, well, China has high savings rates because they lack certain social structures to, you know, incentivize savings and other things like that. If this gains traction, what can we expect from a Chinese consumer culture going forward?
Do you want to rephrase the question?
In other words,
what's the link between
the Chinese Social Security
fund and consumer behavior?
Well, it's grown significantly.
Okay, but are you arguing that therefore that when consumer goods are available, savings rates will go down? Is that your argument?
Perhaps.
Okay, fine.
Maybe savings rates in Asia are generally, it's argued that they're generally high because they lack institutional structures that promote savings, things like Social Security, healthcare, and things like that. If those things begin to be implemented broadly, there might be implications for the consumer culture.
Okay. Well, the way I'd answer that is to say that's the norm. That's what most economists are expecting. But if savings rates in China were to decline from 50% to 25%, it would still be 5 times our level. So there's absolutely no reason why they can't generate internal growth from that. I thought you were leading in a different direction, and that was will these investment funds become really heavyweight sovereign investors overseas, like, for example, the Singaporean investment trust? And my guess is they probably will. And I think we're going to have to decide in this country how we want to respond to that. For those of you who haven't followed the Singapore Trust, it was a major part in the overthrow of the Prime Minister of Thailand because of the deal that he cut with the Singapore Trust to sell his telecommunications company. So sovereign funds have a very political content to it. Mary, do you want to
I was just going to say, I mean, the CIC, which is China International Corporation, headed by Dashi Ching as the president, Lo Jiwei is the head, of course, is investing massive amounts overseas and has $200 billion, which they are placed only overseas investment. The fund that you referred to, the Social Security Fund, which is headed by Da Shenlong and Li Keping, is actually the central pension fund of China. And it's funded through, you probably know, the process of, you know, a combination of lottery and sale of 10% of IPO, and also from the Ministry of Finance. Now those funds have outside investors who come in and advise at what we, well, relatively small amounts as opposed to what CIC does. But again, there has been some overseas investment, but it's very limited and very controlled, and they are looking at potentially how much or what could be invested overseas, but that money is basically for pensions, and so it's very conservatively managed.
Right here. And you have the microphone, please. You do it? Maybe next.
It's Clemente Cohen's my name. I'm retired. That's my occupation at the moment.
How's it going?
So far. It's a three-part question. I'll let you connect the dots. In the Old West, we used to have a fight over water. You know, water rights, Middle East, the same thing. Will the fight and future fight, in a sense, be over all the you know, oil, all the natural products that are trying to get into China? That's number one. Number two, how will India react to all of this? Will that be a flashpoint for both of them? And the third part, I'll let you connect the dots, is will the middle class grow large enough to make it a bigger democracy than it is today?
Okay, why don't I take the first two and you want to do the democracy or not? Yep. Okay. On the question of water rights, this is already a major problem between China and India. And I think this comes back to Jim's point about innovation. All of us in the US, in the Middle East, and certainly in Asia are going to have to focus on new ways to use water more effectively and recycling and so on. I don't see any reason why the Chinese won't be very active in that process. They're already there, but the point is I don't see any reason why they can't be just as successful as we are at that. In terms of the international borders, they're also complicated by the fact that China has a very close relationship with Pakistan, a long-term relationship, and that's a source of great irritation to India. So some of you may have heard an earlier panel that we had a couple of years ago here where we talked about the term Chindia, which Business Week ran as a cover story. And I was making light of that because I thought that ultimately both China and India have major power objectives, and though they can cooperate economically, they're not likely to be able to resolve some of these fundamental differences on power projection, and that relates to water. And I think that also relates to the broader question of materials and consumption. Yes.
I didn't phrase it right. And that is, there's more than one issue involved. It's not just water. It's all kinds of natural products that they need. Is that going to create more flashpoints with different groups of people to make it a very, very tinderbox type of world?
Well, certainly there's going to be more tension. And again, as the lady raised in her earlier question, there's going to be a broader set of major economies that are going to compete for the resources that the US and the Europeans have been consuming for the last 150 years. So I think we just need to adjust to that. On the other hand, I'm not pessimistic that we can't have dramatic increases in the efficiency of our use of these materials, plus recycling. And also, as prices of materials go up, the attractiveness of recycling also goes up. So I'm not, I mean, if you look at sort of energy per unit of production since 1973, when OPEC first raised the oil prices, there's been a dramatic reduction in energy per unit of product. And I don't see any reason why that will not only continue, but maybe even increase. So yes, there will be flashpoints, particularly in countries where the technologies are not well developed. But the Chinese see this coming, but to come back to India, their differences with India relate partly to Tibet, partly to the Himalayan kingdoms, partly to Pakistan, partly now to this new Chinese venture in Sri Lanka. You know, it's complicated, and so it's not just one feature, it's a combination of features.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question, because we swore on our stack of Bibles we're going to finish on time. Unless you can answer this really quickly, we maybe fit one more in. But yes, sir. Right here.
Nathan Ramia from West Point. How do you see the potential for developing and leveraging our relationships in Southeast Asia as a way forward, engaging China on U.S. terms? And do you think that engagement in Southeast Asia would be better handled bilaterally or on a multilateral basis with the East Asian Summit, ASEAN, APEC, TVPs, etc.?
Having lived in Indonesia and speaking Indonesian and lived in Thailand, I'm glad to respond. Basically, the U.S. blew this terribly during the Bush administration. And the best example of this was at the ASEAN Summit, where the U.S. pushed for trying to make ASEAN into a counterterrorism organization. And Hu Jintao showed up, got all the attention, and our president got ignored. So I think that those people who knew what was going on in Southeast Asia knew the U.S. overplayed its hand. The other thing to be conscious of is that the Chinese have already split ASEAN. Burma, Cambodia, and Laos are pro-China. And the Thai ultimately migrated from China, you know, about 900 years ago. So there's a lot of cultural similarity between Thai culture and Chinese culture. The Vietnamese are generally anti-Chinese, and the Muslim countries in Southeast Asia are deeply skeptical of China. But the original aspiration of ASEAN, that ASEAN would be an independent 10-country entity, is clearly not going to happen. And the Chinese have very carefully exacerbated the splits within ASEAN. So I don't see ASEAN acting as a bloc. I think ASEAN is basically split between the North and the South. And I think that will go on for a long time. And I don't see any reason why the Chinese would change their strategy.
One last question. I think we can sneak this in. Sorry, I know you're the boss, but I promise.
I believe China has announced the indication to build approximately 100 nuclear power plants. I don't know whether they are going to be proliferative or non-proliferative. Since India 123 agreement is with non-proliferative nuclear, what do you think the impact of China's nuclear aspirations are given U.S. policy?
And we have 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, the Chinese have changed their position about proliferation in the last decade. I think that they were definitely playing footsie with the Iranians, with the Pakistanis, and there's a debate about what they were really doing with the North Koreans. The Chinese claim that they never wanted the North Koreans to have nuclear weapons, and so on. On the other hand, it turns out that the AQ-Khan network played some role in what North Korea did. So, this is sort of, to quote Churchill, sort of an enigma wrapped in shrouds of uncertainty. And I don't think we're going to know exactly what led to that. But I think recently, certainly the last 5 years, the Chinese have recognized that nuclear proliferation is a big negative for them. So my answer would be that they will keep very tight control over their own nuclear material. Now, the dilemma for them, to come back to the South Asian balance, is they don't want India to dominate South Asia. So they're not going to be really tough on Pakistan. And the big issue, I'm planning some new research on these topics. The big issue is going to be Central Asia. At some point, the U.S. will be leaving Afghanistan. It's not clear exactly how long that will be, but at some point we will. And that will mean that we will not need the overflight rights into Central Asia as much as we do now. The Chinese played a part in getting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to issue a call for the U.S. withdrawal from Central Asia. So I personally am a realist, and I think that there's going to be a competition between the Russians and the Chinese for influence in Central Asia. So this is to be continued. Maybe Jim will want to chair a panel in next year's forum. But I would say the next big competition is going to be in Central Asia, and whether the U.S. is a part of it will depend upon whether those countries want it and whether the American public has any appetite for it.
China just signed up a long-term agreement for uranium, which indicates it would be proliferative nuclear. So is the United States, I mean, is that grave cause for concern?
I'd be skeptical. The Chinese very definitely know that it's not to their advantage for other countries on their periphery, at least, to have nuclear capabilities. And they are sorely vexed by the North Koreans. So I think you need to be careful before you make sweeping claims.
Okay, this is the end. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks to David and Mary.